Okay, hi Jupiter. We are back for chapter 4 of Mr. Majeika, and this chapter is called The Frog's Princess. I wonder if we find out what happens to Hamish in this chapter. Okay. Thomas and Pete thought for a moment. Then Thomas said, "Don't worry about it yet, Mr. Magic. Hamish Bigmore's parents are away and he's staying with us. You've got 2 days to find the right spell before they come back and expect to find him." 2 days? Repeated Mr. Majeika. In that case, there's a chance. We shall simply have to see what happens at midnight. Midnight? Asked Jodie. My friend, said Mr. Majeika, surely you know that in fairy stories everything returns to its proper shape when the clock strikes 12. Cinderella's coach, said Jodie. Exactly, answered Mr. Majeika, but one can't be certain of it. There's only a chance, and I'll stay here tonight and see what happens. And with that, Class 3 went home, and there's Mr. Majeika sat there on his own, waiting to see what happens. Thomas and Pete felt that really they should have taken Hamish Bigmore home with them, even if he was a frog. After all, he was supposed to be staying with them. But, said Pete, it's not easy carrying frogs. He might escape and jump into a river or something, and we'd never see him again. That's a very good thing too, said Thomas. You can't say that, remarked Pete. He may be only Hamish Bigmore to you and me, but to his mum and dad he's darling little Hamie, or something like that. And just think what it would be like to be a mother and father to a frog, going to the shops and the library and that sort of thing, and people saying, "Oh, Mrs. Bigmore, what a sweet little frog you're carrying in this jar." And Hamish's mum having to say, "Oh, Mrs. Smith, that's not just a frog, that's our son Hamish." When Thomas and Pete's mum saw them at the school gates, the first thing she said was, "Where's Hamish?" And they had quite a time persuading her that Hamish wouldn't be coming home with them that afternoon or staying the night, but was visiting friends and was being perfectly well taken care of. Who are these friends? She asked suspiciously. What's their name? Tadpoles, said Pete without thinking. Silly boy, whispered Thomas, kicking him. We don't know their name, he told his mum. But Mr. Majeika, our new teacher, arranged it, so it must be all right. Oh, did he? Said their mum. Well, he might have told me, but I suppose I shouldn't fuss. And she took them home. When they got back to school the next morning, Hamish Bigmore was still a frog. There he is. Hamish as the frog. Nothing happened at all, said Mr. Majeika gloomily. He tried to make Class 3 get on with their ordinary work, but it wasn't much use. Nobody had their minds on anything but Hamish Bigmore swimming up and down in his tank. Everyone kept making suggestions to Mr. Majeika. Mr. Magic, couldn't you just get a magic wand and wave it over him? Couldn't you just say abracadabra and see if that works? Couldn't you find another wizard and ask him what to do? Oh, my friends, said Mr. Majeika. It's no use, there's nothing else to try. Last night, while I was here alone, I made use of every possible means I know, and I can do nothing. And as to finding another wizard, that would be very hard indeed. There are so very few still working, and we don't know each other's names. It might take me years to find another one, and even then, he might not have the answer. Class 3 went home rather gloomily that day. They'd all begun to feel sorry for Hamish Bigmore. He's staying with friends again, Thomas and Pete told their mother. The next day was Friday. Hamish Bigmore's parents were due to come home that evening. Halfway through morning school, Jodie suddenly put her hand up and said, Mr. Magic? Yes, Jodie? Mr. Magic, I've got an idea. You said that things sometimes happen like they do in fairy stories. I mean, like Cinderella's coach turning back into a pumpkin. Yeah, sometimes, said Mr. Majeika, but as you've seen with Hamish, not always. Well, said Jodie, there is something that I wondered about. You see, in fairy stories, people are often turned into frogs, and they always get turned back again in the end, don't they? And I've been trying to remember how. Jodie paused. Go on, said Mr. Majeika. Well, said Jodie, I did remember. Frogs turn back into princes when they get kissed by a princess. Mr. Majeika's eyes lit up. Goodness, he said, you're absolutely right. Why didn't I think of that? We must try it at once. Try what, Mr. Magic? Asked Pandora Green. Why, have Hamish Bigmore kissed by a princess, and then I do believe there's a very good chance he will change back. But please, Mr. Magic, said Thomas, how are you going to manage that? I mean, there's not so very many princesses around these days, not as many as in fairy stories. There's some at Buckingham Palace, said Pandora. But they don't go around kissing frogs, said Thomas. You bet they don't, said Pete. You see pictures of them in newspapers doing all sorts of things, opening new hospitals and naming ships, and that sort of thing, but they don't kiss frogs. Are you sure, my young friend? Said Mr. Majeika gloomily. Quite sure, said Thomas, unless they do it when nobody's looking. I mean, it's not the sort of thing they get much fun out of, is it? Frog kissing. I mean, I bet, said Pete, that a real-life princess wouldn't do it if you paid her thousands of pounds. Oh, just imagine, said Thomas, going to Buckingham Palace and ringing the doorbell and saying, please, have you got any princesses in today? And would they mind kissing a frog for us? They'd probably fetch the police. Oh dear, said Mr. Majeika, I'm afraid you're right. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Mr. Majeika said gloomily, it seems that Hamish Bigmore will have to remain a frog. Oh, I wonder what his parents are going to say. Please, said Jodie, I've got an idea again. It might be silly, but it might work. What I think is, if we can't get a real princess, we might pretend to have one. Make a kind of play, dress up somebody like a princess. Do you think that's silly? She looked hopefully at Mr. Majeika. Not at all, said Mr. Majeika. We've nothing to lose by trying it. Which was how Class 3 came to spend a good deal of the morning trying to make the room look like a royal palace in a fairy story. They found the school caretaker and persuaded him to lend them some old blue curtains that were used for the play at the end of term. And Mr. Honey and Mrs. Honey, who taught the nursery class, agreed to give them a box of dressing up clothes and that the little children used. In this were several crowns and robes and other things that could be made to look royal. Then there was a dreadful argument about who was to play the princess. Jodie said she ought to because it had all been her idea. Pandora Green said she should because she looked pretty, and princesses always look pretty. Mr. Majeika tried to settle it by saying that Melanie should do it, as she was the only girl in the class who hadn't asked to. But Melanie, who hated the idea of kissing a frog, started to cry. So in the end, Mr. Majeika said that Jodie should do it after all, and the other girls could be sort of princesses too, only Jodie would play the chief one. Then they got ready. A kind of throne had been made out of Mr. Majeika's chair, with one of the blue curtains draped over it. I'll show you the picture of them all waiting. So there's the princesses. Jodie wore another one of the curtains as a cloak and one of the crowns and a lot of coloured beads from the dressing up box, and all the other girls stood around her. Mr. Majeika turned out the clashing lights and drew the curtains. Then he said he thought they ought to have some music, just to make things seem more fairy-like. So Thomas got out his recorder and played God Save the Queen, Good King Wenceslas, and were the only tunes that he knew. They didn't seem quite right for the occasion, but Mr. Majeika said they would have to do. Then he told Jodie to start being the princess and say the sort of things that princesses might say in fairy stories. Jodie thought for a moment. Then she said in a high voice, Oh, my daughters, I have heard that in this kingdom there is a poor prince who has been enchanted into a frog by some wicked magician. She turned to Mr. Majeika and whispered, You're not wicked, really, Mr. Magic, but that's what happens in fairy stories, isn't it? Of course, said Mr. Majeika. Please continue. You're doing so splendidly. On went Jodie. I do request that one of you shall speedily bring me this frog, for I have seen it written that should a princess of the blood royal kiss this poor frog with her own lips, he will regain his proper shape. She paused. Well, go on, somebody, she hissed. Fetch me the frog. It was Mr. Majeika himself who stepped up to the tank, put his hands and drew out Hamish Bigmore, so he did not see the door opening and Mr. Potter coming into the room. Ah, Mr. Majeika, said Mr. Potter, I just wanted to ask you if you could look after the school dinner again today, because... He stopped staring at the extraordinary scene. Mr. Majeika was kneeling on one knee in front of Jodie, holding out the frog. Go on, he whispered. I feel the magic working. Oh, frog, said Jodie in her high voice. Oh, frog, I command you, turn back into a prince. And she kissed the frog. Now, really, said Mr. Potter, I am not at all in favour of nature study being mixed up with story times, and school curtains should not be used for this sort of thing. While as to that frog, it's a proper place, it's a pond. I'll allow tadpoles in school, but not frogs. They jump out of tanks and get all over the place. Now, if you'll just hand that one over, where is it? Here I am, said Hamish Pigmore. He had appeared out of nowhere and the frog was gone. Mr. Potter sat down very suddenly in the nearest chair. Oh, I don't feel very well at all, he said. Ah, said Hamish. You should try being a frog for a few days. Does you no end of good. Makes you feel really healthy, I can tell you. And all that swimming about, why, I've never felt better in my life. And being kissed by a princess too. Not that my princess was a real one. He turned to Mr. Majeika. You really shouldn't have taken me to Buckingham Palace. You really should have taken me to Buckingham Palace, he said. I'm sure the Queen herself would have done it. To oblige me. Mr. Potter got to his feet and left the room, muttering something about needing to go and see a doctor because he was imagining things. And now, said Hamish Bigmore to class 3, I'm going to tell you about the life and habits of the frog, which he did at great length. Oh dear, said Pete to Thomas. He's worse than ever. And that is the end of chapter 4. Ready for chapter 5 tomorrow? I'll give you a little sneak peek. It's called The Disappearing Bottle. Okay. And we'll see you tomorrow for that chapter. Bye.